This is WCG Patient Radio. I'm Steve Smith from Patient Advocacy at WCG, a company focused on the ethical treatment of people who volunteer in clinical trials to create new medicines for unmet medical needs. We're speaking today with Mark Opler, the Chief Research Officer at MedAvante-ProPhase, a part of WCG that provides service in support of clinical research, focusing on assessment, measurement, and technology to help clinicians, patients, and caregivers capture data. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Steve. Thank you so much for having me today.
Sure. You're a PhD in psychometrics, a nice word I like to say, and your focus is psychiatry and rare disorders. And we have new podcasts in this very series about rare disorders. And we have podcasts on the MPS diseases, on Angelman's syndrome and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which will be interesting to our listeners. And those podcasts are speaking with some experts and also patient family members who, because their children have these diseases, are experts. And like many rare diseases, these disease communities struggle to get clinical trials started and treatments approved. MPS has approved drugs, yet still fights for a cure instead of just treatments. Angelman syndrome has no trials in recent memory, but now has hope for breakthroughs because at least 5 companies are finally doing trials, very modern ones with precision medicine. And Ehlers-Danlos community and researchers are still working together to try to find ways to get trials started that could lead to treatments for that very debilitating disease. In all these cases, time is of the essence, and patients are suffering progressive damage that is irreparable. And so anything that we can do as an industry and as patient advocates to move things along is of utmost importance to these groups. What is the difference, Mark, about rare disease studies from your perspective?
Well, that's a great question, Steve. So there are a number of things that make rare disease studies special. I think the first one, obviously, is the tremendous unmet need for these disorders makes these kinds of trials, these kinds of studies exceedingly urgent in every sense of the word. From the need to get them started up quickly and efficiently, the need to get patients enrolled rapidly and begin their involvement in the study, making the involvement of caregivers, I think, as straightforward and as streamlined as possible. These have a special urgency in rare disease studies. Obviously, every clinical trial is vital and important, but in rare disease studies, we also face the challenge that sometimes we're blazing new trails, we're breaking new ground, and we're having to really push ourselves and our systems to the limit. One area that I focus on is measurement, right? Measuring to see that the drugs that are being tested are safe, that they are efficacious, and that they're improving the conditions of not just the patient, but also the families involved in a way that is measurable, meaningful, and reliable. So these are challenging studies logistically, scientifically, and they have, as I said before, a special urgency in the work that we do.
You're mentioning 2 of the most important measures, because to get a treatment approved by the FDA, clinical trials must show those 2 things you just mentioned, safety and efficacy, which is basically saying that the drug works the way we think it will. And the latter, this measure of whether the drug actually works the way we think it will, is hard in rare diseases because of such small patient populations where statistical power is hard to come by. So what strategies are being used now to help determine if new treatments for rare diseases are efficacious?
Yeah, it's another important question, Steve. I think the challenge that those of us in measurement science face when we're working with a rare disease is that very often there is no well-established gold standard for evaluating the effectiveness of a drug, right? I mean, for example, in, let's say, depression, we have a number of scales and instruments and endpoints that are routinely used, questionnaires that are accepted by the regulatory agencies, and that everyone agrees on to a greater or lesser degree. When we're working in rare disease, however, there is no such thing as the one true measure, the one true outcome. And the companies that work on these studies, the scientists that dedicate their lives to them, very often have to convince all the stakeholders involved that a given measurement, a given endpoint is the right one, right? So we wind up often using a battery of different endpoints. And because many of the rare diseases that I and my colleagues work on are diseases of neurodevelopment, they involve a lot of different areas, including motor development, cognition, different aspects of functioning, and so forth, that really require, unfortunately, sometimes a lot of different measures to be used together, which can create a certain amount of burden on both the doctors and scientists that work on these studies, but I think most importantly on the patients and caregivers. We want to capture everything, and we want to make sure we don't miss anything because these patients and their families' involvement is so precious. But it is a challenge. We're still trying to figure out the best way forward often.
I know that families and caregivers have a lot to share that actually can help move the needle in terms of how the measurements are done, how clinical trials are designed, what matters most to them, and that a lot of these children in the diseases that are spoken about in our other podcasts, in the MPS community, that's 11 diseases if you break it down. Different mucopolysaccharidoses is the long name for MPS. Those children are born seeming very normal, but because they lack an enzyme, there's a progressive damaging disorder. And the parents report things like, over time they've lost the ability to communicate with their children that they used to have fine communication with. So there's a race against time. And I know we're asking, as we figure out how to measure all these things, what matters most to them. So tell us a little bit about what's being done to give families, parents, and other stakeholders more of a voice in the selection and the development of the outcomes in clinical research, or as you mentioned, the measures, the biomarkers, and so forth.
Yeah. You use an important phrase, what matters most. I think one thing that I have learned from the caregivers and the parents that work in these studies is that every participant, especially in neurodevelopment, when we're often dealing with young children, sometimes toddlers and infants, there are no two participants, no two patients that are alike. And even within theoretically a single disease, take any of the MPS disorders, MPS 3, for example, we do a lot of work in. You see different symptoms.
Sanfilippo syndrome is NPS 3. It's a devastating disease in the sense that the children completely lose any ability to communicate in a normal way, and they mostly pass away in their early 20s if they haven't done so in their teenage years. So it's very, very upsetting.
That's exactly right, Steve. And when we work in these studies, we're capturing measures of motor function, we're capturing measures of communication and cognition. And what we hear often is that different parents want and yearn for different things, partly because the children that participate in these studies show up with different problems. No two present exactly the same way. Although there are commonalities, again, parents may often take different points of view over what matters most to them and to their child. So, we're finding we have to work very closely with study teams, with caregivers, with all the clinical trial professionals that are involved to try to strike that balance. We have to have reliable, measurable, repeatable endpoints so we can track change over time. But we also want to capture that unique voice in the case of every caregiver and every participant, every patient. One technique that I find very intriguing and that I think holds a lot of promise is an old technique, but one that I think we're starting to see some traction in, where we actually allow the caregiver, the parent, to help define an endpoint that's important to them. So, for example, in some studies, we use something called goal attainment scaling. And this allows, say, the clinician to sit down with the parent and help the parent find and define a problem, a challenge that they would like to see progress in, and build actually a little 5-point scale around that symptom, that function, whatever it turns out to be, and they will work together to measure that over time. Similarly, we see other variations on a theme of this approach where parents define what they want to get out of a treatment, and we see the extent to which that treatment can fulfill that need.
And how is technology helping to move the field forward?
One thing technology's done is it's made it possible to conduct more evaluations and collect more data outside of the research site. So, I was thinking, for example, about the podcast you had earlier with Mark Dant, whose son Ryan had MPS 1, as memory serves. And with MPS 1, with MPS 3, with all of these lysosomal storage disorders, mobility is a problem. And anyone who's been the parent of a child with a medical problem knows that getting them where they need to be is often complex. So technology allows us to do in a more mobile way things that we used to have to do in a laboratory, whether that's capturing video to look at, for example, a child's gait and ability to stand up or walk, whether that's conducting interviews with parents by video conference or by old-fashioned telephone. We can do that now in a secure and remote way that wasn't as easy to do 10, 15 years ago.
Yes, I know there was a series of videos made by a filmmaker named Louise Tiranoff on Angelman syndrome back in the early 2000s when digital video was beginning to be a thing, and she had the vision to say, there are going to be families with Angelman syndrome in doctors' offices wondering exactly what the people have, because diagnosis is quite an odyssey. They call it the diagnostic odyssey because it takes so long. And if you can get things figured out sooner, you can do something about what's happening sooner. So she had exactly that vision that you mentioned, that a doctor would be able to dial up on his or her laptop what is the gait of, say, a 12-year-old girl with Angelman's or an 18-year-old boy or a young man or whatever. So that is a point in clinical research where families are right there in front of the physician, but it's not necessarily clear what's going on. And then you move down closer to the beginning of a clinical trial where families you just mentioned are involved in helping to select measurements. And then, of course, if there can be trials, and there are now for Angelman syndrome, as that other podcast says, the involvement of the families is, of course, now critical to enroll and to adhere and so forth.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would just add to that, I'm thinking about some of the rare disease studies that we've conducted where they've had to fly families in from other countries sometimes. That is, in addition to being, tremendously burdensome on families, very expensive, and perhaps something that as time goes by we can help to offset through virtual approaches to assessment, to measurement, to collection of data. Cell phones are ubiquitous now, and we're using these devices even as we speak to do things that would have required the family to get on an airplane sometimes and fly halfway around the world.
Yes, clinical trials get so burdensome that many choose not to participate or just simply couldn't participate. And that travel issue is definitely one, because the rare disease folks have to go so far to get to those few specialist medical centers where the trials occur. So virtual technology has recently begun to be adopted by the pharmaceutical companies running clinical trials and hospitals treating patients. So for some procedures, and measurements, patients can be at home, parents can stay, at work and doing the caregiving thing, and in some cases, the patients are even able to do their normal daily routine without having to travel to a hospital and sit in a waiting room, basically. So this is all about reducing the burden of a clinical trial places on a family. And if you're struggling for enough patients, you don't want to lose any because of burden.
That's exactly right. And one other thing I would add to that, it may improve to some extent the validity of the data. What I mean by that is, when we conduct assessments in a doctor's office or a clinic, we're missing something. We're missing the context in which the patient actually lives, right? Evaluations conducted in the home, whether that's watching a child walk across a kitchen floor, whether that is speaking to parents about the burdens that they're facing, they may be more valid and maybe even more meaningful if we can capture them in the environment in which they spend most of their time.
Yes. It's much more realistic than, say, taking a child out to the hallway of the hospital to do a 6-minute walk test, which is nice, but it's not nearly as accurate as what's really happening in terms of the child's daily routine and how are things improving or worse or getting worse.
Exactly. One of the areas of tremendous interest in our field is the use of wireless, even wearable devices. So, say something akin to a Fitbit worn over the course of, say, 12 hours may give us an enormous amount of data that's incredibly valuable. And I look forward to a day where we can capture endpoints that are both interesting and innovative like that, as well as work with parents to define the outcomes that they feel are most meaningful to them as these trials continue.
So a lot of your work, I think you're saying, focuses on the use of these digital devices, whether it's a tablet used to collect patient outcomes at a clinic or some remote measure device, but not just use them to collect data like the average person wearing a Fitbit during the day, but in something that's really clinically very robust and could be used to collect evidence submitted to the FDA to prove safety or efficacy. In other words, how to make those measurements really effective. Is that what we're talking about here?
I think that's the vision, Steve. We're ways off yet, I think, from a day when device-reported outcomes, if you want to call them that, data captured by machine replaces or even meaningfully augments to some extent the evaluations of expert clinicians or the reports of family members. But we're getting there. And I think, we need to work closely with families, with caregivers, with stakeholders to make sure that as technology progresses, we're still evaluating what matters most to them in the health and well-being of their children.
So the advice to startup groups of scientists who are going to get a biotech up in a new clinical trial is definitely to do what's becoming a best practice, and that's involve the families early on, even before you design the trial, and keep them involved, because that really is going to make the difference in the success of that trial.
I couldn't agree more with that statement, Steve. I think technology is a wonderful thing. It gives us windows into sources of data that we simply didn't have some time ago. But we can't lose sight of the fact that the objective of all of this work and all of this effort is to help improve the lives of people suffering with terrible diseases and caring for children often whose lives are unnaturally short. So we have to keep that in the front of our minds as we do our work. We want to be good scientists. And part of being a good scientist is making sure that we keep in mind the ethical objectives of what we're trying to achieve.
Well, I love the teamwork that you're expressing between science, medicine, and patients. And I thank you for being on the podcast today, Mark Opler. It's a wonderful thing to hear, and I know we could go on and on, but thanks for coming. And we are speaking today with Mark Opler, the Chief Research Officer at MedAvante-ProPhase, a part of WCG that provides services in support of clinical research. focusing on assessment, measurement, and technology to help clinicians, patients, and caregivers capture data. You can find out more at WCGclinical.com. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you for everything, Steve.
Bye-bye.